thank you so much for being here. This is false color for the rest of us. By the end of this, you will know, hopefully, what the false color part of this means. If you know that already, great. And then you'll know what I mean by the rest of us. First of all, who am I? This is my first time here, but a longtime admirer of NACIS, so I'm really honored to be here. I was born in Baltimore. I'm Vietnamese. In the last 10 years, I've been living and working in California, but now I'm in New York City, so if you're in that area, please befriend me, because I need friends. Hannah mentioned my past. I did make the switch to journalism, and today I'm very happy to be part of the West Coast team at the Washington Post. I'm also happy to be at the Washington Post, I guess I should say. If you want to contact me, this will be up later, but please email me or go to my outdated portfolio. Don't tweet at me. So we have 3 topics we're going to get through. What we get false, that's an introduction to false color. If you're aware of that, then you can check Slack. Novel applications or applications of false color that I find novel. And the general vibe here is that by the end of it, hopefully we'll all feel inspired to be creative in this medium. Note that this middle section will take a little bit of a minute, but maybe where you want to draw your attention to. This is a dog tax. This is my puppy, who's not a puppy, senior dog, Hadley, in Aquatic Park in San Francisco. So what we get false. False color, who is she? We're going to talk about this sort of scientific application as I understand it, a lot of caveats there, and then the limitations of remotely sensed data. Okay, so you might remember that there is a spectrum here, and us humans with our sensitive eyes only have a very narrow window into the visible light spectrum. So before we start talking about false color, we need to understand what is true color. So in multispectral data, this refers to the red, green, and blue bands represented as we perceive those colors. So then false color is whenever we bring in non-visible light into the red, green, or blue channels. And I would argue, like, if we want to use false color loosely, it's any time we are ascribing data into those channels to make it meaningful, or, data visualization. So in other words, what are we talking about? If you're used to band manipulation in QGIS or in the command line, a true color image would be red means red, green means green, and blue means blue. But perhaps if you're interested in plant vegetation, a common application is doing a red shift, where near infrared is now red, red is now green, and green is blue. And if you want to look at flooding imagery or burning, maybe shortwave infrared is now red, and near infrared is green, and green is blue. If you want to get real topsy-turvy and look at clouds or ice and snow, you could use 2 different types of shortwave infrared on green and blue. The world is your oyster. Here, visually, what are we talking about? On the left, this is a satellite image that you might expect if you open up Google Maps. If you've worked and toned this imagery before, that is red, green is green, blue is blue. And on the right is an example of that near-infrared red shift, where things that are a level of green that only sort of the birds and the bees are seeing in that near-infrared spectrum is now coded in red. So like healthy greens that we can't understand are now brightly red. But that might not be very intuitive to someone who is not, doesn't have a graduate degree in remote sensing like myself. Just a little sidebar. If you are an active learner, if you are someone who does much better with hands-on tools, highly recommend that you get a login to EO browser produced by Sentinel through ISA. It allows all these sort of pre-baked different applications of false color so you can get your feet wet. You can also drag and drop bands from any number of their products or products that they ingest in their pipeline. It's very user-friendly. You don't have to worry about data downloading, which we'll get to in a minute. So how does this look typically? Here's an image from Jesse Allen of NASA Earth Observatory, where this is a true color image, right? This is a sand fire outside of Santa Clarita. If you've looked at wildfire imagery, this might look familiar. However, sometimes a limitation of this is that it's difficult to distinguish between that arid landscape or the mountainous regions from the burns that we were trying to look at. that's when using false color is appropriate in this setting. The burn scar is now very readily apparent to you. It is brightly red. But maybe to someone who hasn't encountered this imagery before, they're wondering, or they might wonder why the landscape is also very green. And then another aside in terms of the sort of limitations of this data. You might remember that the atmosphere is what protects us and make life as we know it possible on this planet. So when we're talking about bands that are detected by satellite on this very planet, we aren't talking about swapping in gamma or X-ray or some versions of ultraviolet radiation. We're talking about the UV that we protect ourselves with sunscreen for now, until the ozone, whatever, and up to infrared, and then a wide area of radio bands that we use typically for communications. Okay, so we're all caught up with false color as it stands. Here are some novel applications of false color. As I mentioned, my background currently is reporting with false color imagery. And I feel like false color in the newsroom is sort of like when we really want to make a bivariate map, but oftentimes the opportunity is never really great. And so too, I think the opportunities don't present themselves very often, but I have two examples we're going to go over here. So VIIRS, or night sky data, if you've ever watched, say, a sci-fi movie and see aliens coming in with north pointing up, you might be familiar with this kind of perception of night, right, where these lights are yellow. Or if you were riding the funicular at night and saw Pittsburgh, yeah, like this is a sort of representation of how we might perceive light at night. It is an illusion, though. The way we can build off of that, since our readers are typically expecting that, is to just work in that visual language from the beginning. So here, when I was at CNN, I worked on a story right when Russia invaded Ukraine, and to show how the night sky looked typically, we show a January composite of that VIIRS imagery here, and then we show that after imagery where the city's dimmed for a variety of reasons. But there is a little bit more we can do in false color. I was inspired by the Payne Institute for Public Policy, the Earth Observation Group there. What they did was they took a time series data and split it across red, green, and blue bands. So what are we looking at here? You look at it for a second while I drink water. What they did is they took an acquisition from VIIRS, a mosaic of data from January 2022. And then on the green and blue, they have an acquisition in March and a thermal band on blue. When we put this in a single image, that means that the light in the sky or the light on the ground that we would normally see registers red. The light that overlaps would be yellow, and the new color, the new information that we don't typically expect in a January appears green, and in this case, it's a military activity. That took a lot to explain for me personally just now, and so what I did when I presented this was I flipped the bands a little bit around so that the red and green is actually the recently acquired data, the February 28th data in this case, and the blue band is that January composite. And what this does instead is that yellow imagery that we are used to seeing night light imagery as appears yellow. So that's the new activity. Whereas the old activity, the stuff that isn't there anymore, is now blue. And I'd argue that when you see blues or dark blues in this context, you naturally think, okay, dimmer or darker. So there's a little bit less hand-holding that you have to take a reader through. Another great example of this is from a colleague, Janice, who's in the room, where they took high-resolution black marble data and produced a pseudo-color of it in a small multiple in a grid-like fashion so that the reader can go column by column through this table for each city and then row by row to be like, okay, that is where it was and this is where it became, or what became of it. So if we go back to that atmospheric window, when journalists are looking at imagery, particularly in a disaster context, when a hurricane comes, it brings clouds with it, right? When flooding is happening, there are likely clouds. If you're familiar with this, you know where I am going. SAR imagery, or synthetic aperture radar, can help us in this situation where we need to know immediately what the situation on the ground looks like. Now, I'm going to make these slides available later, but if you want to get really into the weeds, I have another talk about what synthetic aperture radar is or how it works from a lay perspective. The link is here on this slide. But the short of it is there's a lot of benefits. See you later clouds, like I mentioned. There are all sorts of bands that we can work with that are really beyond me as to all the different applications. There are different polarizations, and there's interferometry, or InSAR, that allows us to, as an applied product, read information that's happening on the ground. More on that later. So those applications lend themselves to flood mapping, detecting changes in forestry, object classification, and surface deformation, to name a few. And this is an active field that you all are probably well aware of, that people are always figuring out new tools here. So what does SAR imagery look like, right? This is a famous, or relatively famous, when the Larsen C iceberg cleaved and broke off. There's a Sentinel-1 imagery was able to be created from this. And what you might notice right now is that it's black and white, and that's because the radar part of this, right? Sound is coming in and being reflected back to the device that's measuring it. And when sound hits water, it does wild things. Mainly, it doesn't bounce back as you might expect. So when we're doing SAR imagery, it's helpful in these next slides to know that black data, or no data in this case, generally or can mean water, among other things. So when Hurricane Fiona came to Puerto Rico and there were clouds over it, but we wanted to know, given our ground reporting that there was flooding, where is the flooding happening? I used a similar technique from that Ukraine night lights map, but with SAR data instead. So in this image that was created, the red and green bands have that after image, and the blue bands have that before image. And if you have done flood or hazard mapping with this before, it might seem inverted to what you might be used to. And that's because I want to make the blue, the flooding, to be blue. Sometimes when we're doing this, it's the reverse, which makes the flooded areas red. But to a reader, they might be very confused why water is red. Not so for a scientist. There are some limitations here where you might see in this, in these hills, we have a lot of noise that's reading as blue, which isn't rain. And this is just me pointing out the flaws here. For a complete step-by-step guide, I've made a PDF available here through this. I'm going to talk through what is available. It's based on a lot of existing literature out there. I say literature, YouTube videos. But the high level is how I get the data is I use EO Browser because I like to look and see if the data is available and usable. Then I go to another tab and open Copernicus Open Access Data Hub because it can't make the data download very easy in the same tool. Or should I say I like downloading from this tool. And then I bring it into a program called SNAP, S-N-A-P, that's produced by ESA, and that's to clean up a lot of the noise in the data, to calibrate it, to terrain map it, and to remap the colors across those bands. You can also do this in Earth Engine, and you might see a pattern here. I have a link to that as well. So if you're more coding happy, you can use this link below and see a demo of it for Florida. And then maybe with GDAL, why the heck not? I see Rob here, so you could do it in GDAL too. But I would still recommend that you use Snap or Earth Engine because it helps with the calibration and all these other fancy things that I don't have a degree for. Okay, inspiration. these are a collection of things that I just see or have seen that I think are like, cool, let's do different things. So here's a pseudo color, I think. It's a grayscale image with a pseudo color for shortwave infrared to highlight that burn scar imagery. I think this is a nice happy medium from my perspective because it's eliminating that neon green issue that we had before. This is what it looks like in true color. This is shout out to Joshua Stevens for this. And then this is an InSAR data. InSAR is a provider of high-resolution SAR data. What the New York Times does here is they show these images back-to-back with some road detail as well, which is very helpful because you can't usually make out features, especially in flood imagery. Helpful annotations, and it's an inverted, the inverse here helps read the flooding a little bit as well too, versus having black data here. Having that InSAR green here helps us know where the flooding on the land happened. And then shout out to the Bloomberg graphics people who are in the room. This is a false color looking at false color time lapse of glacier retreat. Very useful application. I think the cyan here draws out the attention to the glaciers and an otherwise very white and perhaps like hard to distinguish feature, and really gets across, at least for me, oh yeah, that's shrinking. And then if you're like the few who like read my little like preview and said, oh, he's going to talk about InSAR. This is the InSAR part. The California Water Department has a monthly, a monthly data product that produces InSAR data for people to read. Again, InSAR is an application of SAR data. It allows us to understand things like surface deformation, or like when the ground sinks or when the ground rises. So if a defunct mine is flooding and making the ground rise, InSAR is very useful for that. Or in the case of California, where we've dealt with historic drought, when a very rainy season, like this last one we had, comes through, it does make the ground swell. The output of this is a raster, so I know that we're in this like gray area of false color, but I bring this up because I just like want to use you all as a resource to just tap my shoulder and say, have you thought about this? Because I think being able to look at this excellent resource and understand how the landscape is shifting literally beneath California's feet is super helpful, but it's not helpful unless people can just understand it at first flush. So that's false color for the rest of us. I swear to God, this is not a food menu. If you want to read any of the Washington Post stories or others that have come up during this conference, take a picture of that. It's a 4-week free subscription. And then a lot of the literature and YouTube videos and whatnot that went behind making this presentation possible are here. So that is it. Thank you very much, and I'll take questions. Oh, I'm happy to run over anything again, but the slides will be available if someone wants to drop it in the Slack.
Could you go through some of the tools and software that you use to use in these projects?
Yeah, absolutely. With SAR or with all of them, or the question was what tools did I use to produce this? So I use a lot of QGIS for the VIIRS data that we were talking about before, that night light data. Sometimes, depending on the mood, I will use GDAL to do the band reordering, or I will do it in QGIS if it makes sense and QGIS doesn't crash. And yeah, it's very rare. And then the other tool I mentioned, Snap. I've been using that lately for SAR imagery. If you have downloaded it or used online tools before, you might be very confused at what you're looking at. I feel like once the program is very helpful once you get a hang of it. And the YouTube video that I link here really walks you through just like downloading the data and correcting it and making it something you can work with. So I highly recommend it. And that's time. I'm being shaken up. Thank you again so much.